The first gunshot sent shockwaves through the packed sanctuary. Screams echoed as bodies hit the floor, and the air filled with sheer panic. A second shot followed, then silence. At the front of the church, a man lay motionless, blood pooling beneath him. The congregation remained frozen, too stunned to react. No one could process what had just happened. The shooter was his own mother. She didn't run. She didn't resist. She stood there, the gun still in her hands, her expression unreadable. But this wasn't just an act of rage or a moment of madness. It was the result of a secret so vile, so unimaginable, that a mother saw only one way to erase it. By the time the authorities arrived, the truth was already beginning to unravel. What they would uncover in the days that followed would shake the very foundation of faith, family, and morality itself. Some crimes are fueled by hatred, others by revenge. But this was something far worse. Welcome to True Crimes Corner, where we uncover the most shocking and untold cases. Some crimes leave behind more than just victims. They leave behind questions that demand answers. If you believe in exposing the truth and bringing awareness to stories that should never be forgotten, make sure to subscribe and share this video. Because sometimes the most unthinkable crimes happen where you least expect them. To his congregation, Ethan Cole was the perfect pastor. He was charismatic, devoted, and deeply respected. He spoke with conviction, commanding attention every time he stepped behind the pulpit. People believed in him and trusted him. He was seen as a leader, a mentor, and a man of unwavering faith. But Ethan had been living a lie his entire life. From a young age, he knew he was different. Raised in a strict Christian household, he learned early that certain desires were not just frowned upon, they were condemned. He buried them, prayed against them, and convinced himself that if he dedicated his life to God, he could suppress the feelings that had haunted him since high school. He excelled in everything he did. A top student, an athlete, a natural leader. He played basketball, studied computer science, and carried himself with the confidence of someone destined for greatness. But despite these achievements, there was one expectation he couldn't escape: the church. His father, Daniel Cole, had spent decades building their ministry, and it was understood that one day Ethan would take over. When the time came, there was only one condition placed upon him: a pastor must be married. The elders of the church believed that a wife would keep him grounded, eliminate temptation, and ensure he lived up to the role expected of him. So he did what was required. Ethan married Julia, who took his last name to become Julia Cole. The woman everyone believed was his perfect match. She was beautiful, devoted, and deeply in love with him. To her, their marriage was real. To Ethan, it was just another part of the performance. For years, he played the role flawlessly, preaching about righteousness, guiding young men in the congregation, and building a reputation as a man of integrity. A dutiful husband, a loving father, a spiritual leader. But the truth never disappeared. It lingered beneath the surface, growing stronger. Soon, the mask he had worn for so long would begin to crack. From the outside, Ethan and Julia Cole were admired, respected, even envied. Julia was everything a pastor's wife was expected to be: elegant, supportive, devoted to her husband and to the church. Together, they looked like the embodiment of faith and commitment. But the reality was far different. Ethan's love for Julia was never real. To him, she was a necessity, an expectation, a requirement he had to meet to maintain the image of a godly man. Their courtship had been fast, almost transactional. Church elders encouraged the match, and Ethan, knowing it would solidify his position, went along with it. For Julia, it was a dream come true. She had adored Ethan for years from afar. When he proposed, she believed it was a sign from God. In the beginning, everything seemed perfect. They prayed together, attended church events hand in hand, and soon welcomed their daughter, Grace. But Julia eventually started noticing the cracks. Ethan grew distant, and their intimacy slowly faded. He made excuses for the nights he spent on the couch or the times he simply wasn't interested in her. Then came the miscarriages. Twice Julia became pregnant again, and twice she lost the babies. She was devastated, But Ethan's reaction was strange. He showed no real grief, no sadness. If anything, he seemed relieved. That was the moment Julia realized something was deeply wrong. She tried to ignore it, convincing herself that every marriage had its struggles and that her husband was just under pressure. She threw herself deeper into church activities, into motherhood, into being the perfect pastor's wife. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something about her husband was missing. At first, it was just thoughts, fleeting moments of temptation that Ethan quashed with prayer, pleading with God to take them away. But as time passed, thoughts weren't enough, and temptation turned into action. It started subtly. Ethan positioned himself as a mentor to young men in the church, particularly those who were lost, struggling, or seeking guidance. He offered them counsel, comfort, spiritual advice. He built their trust, making them feel special, even chosen. And then, slowly, the lines began to blur. Late-night private meetings, invitations to special prayer sessions, conversations that became too personal, too intimate. For the boys drawn into his world, it was also confusing. He was their pastor, their spiritual father, the man they admired. How could something that felt so wrong be presented as something holy? But Ethan knew exactly how to manipulate the situation. He framed it as part of God's special plan, twisting faith to justify the unspeakable. He reassured his victims that they were chosen, that this was their secret, and that no one else would ever understand. For a while, it worked. No one suspected a thing. Ethan's image remained intact, his reputation untarnished. But eventually, the inevitable happened. One of the boys, a teenager from a devout family, was overwhelmed by guilt. He had believed Ethan's words at first, convincing himself that their relationship was somehow sacred. Now he saw it for the violation it was, and he couldn't stay silent. He confessed everything to his father. The revelation set off a storm no one was prepared for. The boy's father, a devout man and a longtime member of the church, was shaken to his core by what his son told him. At first, he was in denial. He wanted to believe there had been some mistake, that his son had misunderstood something. But the details were too specific, too disturbing. His son was not lying. Unsure of how to handle this terrible truth, the father decided to bring it to the only person he could think of. Ethan's father, Daniel Cole.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
Daniel listened in stunned silence as the man relayed his son's story. He had spent decades building the church and grooming Ethan to carry on the family legacy. Now, in a single conversation, everything he had worked for was being threatened. He sat there, stone-faced, as he learned how his son had preyed on those he was meant to guide. When the boy's father finished speaking, Daniel quietly assured him that he would handle it. That night, Daniel sat alone in the dark, his mind racing. If this was true, he had failed not just as a father, but as a spiritual leader. The weight of the accusation bore down on him. Still, there was no proof, only the word of one young man. Eventually, Daniel worked up the courage to tell his wife, Margaret, what had been confessed. Margaret's reaction was immediate and fierce. She refused to believe any of it. She insisted it was nothing more than a vicious lie meant to tear down their son. Men of God had always been targets for false accusations, she argued, and this was no different. There was not a shred of doubt in her voice. Daniel, however, couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. Something about the accusation lingered in his thoughts. Margaret shut the conversation down, and the ugly secret was buried once more. Daniel did not bring it up again. In the weeks that followed, an uneasy tension took hold in the Cole household. Daniel carried the weight of what he had learned, but with no evidence in Margaret's unyielding faith in their son, he forced himself to act as if nothing was wrong. For his part, Ethan remained outwardly serene, giving no indication that anything was amiss. If he knew about the accusation, he certainly didn't show it. Then came the weekend that changed everything. The church's youth group departed for an annual out-of-town retreat, an event that Ethan normally led. But this year, he announced that he would stay behind. His reason was simple. He needed time to prepare his Sunday sermon. No one questioned him. He was the head pastor, after all, and known for his dedication. That Friday evening, Daniel called Ethan and asked if they could meet. He had a few concerns about the church that he wanted to discuss before Sunday. It wasn't an unusual request. Father and son often spoke privately about church matters, and Ethan agreed without hesitation. But after he hung up the phone, a dark thought crept into Ethan's mind. One so unthinkable it should have stopped him in his tracks. Didn't. Ethan got into his car, drove to a pharmacy, and purchased a bottle of sedatives. This wasn't part of any plan he'd ever imagined, but now that the idea had taken root, it felt like the only solution. He couldn't risk his father asking the wrong questions or digging up truths that were meant to stay buried. Later that night, when Daniel arrived at Ethan's office at the church, everything was in place. They sat facing each other, discussing routine church business. Daniel had no idea that the drink his son had offered him was laced with a powerful drug. As the minutes passed, Daniel began to feel strange. His thoughts grew foggy, his limbs heavy, his vision blurred. Across the desk, Ethan watched silently as his father fought to stay conscious. Daniel's body finally went limp, the sedative dragging him into darkness. And then Ethan committed the unthinkable. He acted on the vile impulse that had overtaken him. What happened in that office was an abomination, a violation of every moral, ethical, and natural law. It was something no son should ever do to his father. But to Ethan, it was just another sin to sweep under the rug. He had no idea that someone else was at the church. Margaret had driven her husband that night, expecting his meeting with Ethan to be brief. As she waited in the parking lot, she fell into conversation with a church member. What began as a simple greeting became a long chat. 5 minutes stretched into 10, then 20, then nearly an hour. They reminisced about the early days of the ministry, about the sacrifices made to build the church, and about the future they hoped for. Margaret had no inkling that inside those walls, her family was being torn apart. When Margaret finally ended the conversation and headed inside, nearly an hour had passed. Worried by how much time had gone by, she walked down the corridor to Ethan's office. She knocked once and, hearing no answer, turned the handle and stepped in. Nothing could have prepared her for what she saw. Daniel was slumped in a chair, unconscious, drugged beyond comprehension. And Ethan was behind him, caught in an act so unspeakable, so profane, that for an instant Margaret couldn't even process it. She froze in the doorway, her mind reeling. This could not be real. This nightmare could not be real. But as Ethan turned to face her, the horrifying reality set in. He didn't panic. He didn't even flinch. Without a word, Ethan walked past his mother and left the room, leaving her standing there in shock. Margaret felt the air leave her lungs. Her hands shook as she rushed to Daniel. She called his name and shook him, trying to rouse him. He was breathing, but barely. His eyes fluttered open for a moment, then shut again. He was alive, but completely unaware of what had just happened to him. Margaret stayed by Daniel's side for what felt like hours, praying and waiting in the silence of that office. Eventually, Daniel began to come around. He had no memory of what had occurred. He was groggy and confused, unable to stand on his own. Margaret said nothing about what she had witnessed. She simply helped him up and half-carried him out to the car. On the drive home, Daniel slipped in and out of consciousness, never realizing the truth of that night. Margaret gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. Her mind was already made up. No one, absolutely no one, would bring shame to the name of the Lord and get away with it. When they arrived home, Margaret gently guided Daniel into bed. He mumbled something incoherent as she pulled the blankets over him, and within minutes he was asleep. She stood over him for a long while in the darkness, watching him breathe. When morning came, Daniel's world would remain intact. He would never have to know the monstrosity that his son had committed. But Margaret knew. She had seen it with her own eyes, and it had shattered something inside her.
Kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
She walked into the living room and sank into her armchair, the house silent around her. The scene replayed again and again in her mind. Ethan, standing behind Daniel, violating every boundary of decency and sanity. Her son, her firstborn child, had done the unthinkable. It wasn't just a sin. It wasn't just a crime. It was an abomination, beyond anything she could have imagined. Margaret had always believed that God could forgive any sin. She had built her life on that belief. But now she found herself questioning it. Some acts, she realized, were beyond forgiveness. Some evils could only be met with justice. She thought about confronting Ethan, forcing him to confess. But what good would that do? Would he repent? Would he change? He had seen her in that doorway and walked away without a hint of fear or remorse. There was nothing left to save in him. Hour after hour, Margaret sat in the dark, praying not for guidance or strength, but for the resolve to do what must be done. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, she knew. In a few hours, the church would gather for Sunday service. Ethan would stand before the congregation and speak of God's love and mercy as if nothing had happened. She could not allow that. Margaret stood and moved through the quiet house with a clear purpose. She went to the bedroom closet and retrieved a small handgun that she and Daniel had owned for years. It had only ever been used at a firing range, but today it would serve a very different purpose. She checked that it was loaded, then settled herself at the kitchen table. Laying the gun in her lap, Margaret whispered a final prayer for forgiveness, for courage, for God's understanding of what she was about to do. Then she waited for Sunday morning to arrive. A few hours later, the church was filled to capacity. The choir had just finished their opening hymn, and the congregation was settling in for the sermon. Ethan Cole stood at the pulpit, his voice ringing out strong and clear as he spoke about forgiveness and redemption. From a pew near the back, Margaret watched in silence. The weight of the gun in her handbag was heavy, but her resolve was heavier. Ethan preached with passion and confidence. To the congregation, he was once again the inspiring young pastor they all loved. Heads were bowed in reverence. Voices murmured amen at his words. But to Margaret, every word was hypocrisy. They saw a man of God. She saw a monster wearing a holy mask. For years, Ethan had deceived them all. He deceived his church, he deceived his wife, he deceived his father. Worst of all, he thought he could deceive God. As Margaret listened to Ethan thunder on about sin and salvation, her rage and sorrow melded into cold certainty. No one else knew the truth. No one else was going to stop him. It had to be her. Margaret rose to her feet. Those nearby thought perhaps she felt the Spirit move her. A few even smiled as she stepped into the aisle, assuming she was overcome by emotion. Margaret walked slowly toward the front of the church, reaching into her purse for the gun. Her eyes never left her son. Ethan was mid-sentence when the first gunshot rang out. The crack of the pistol shattered the sanctuary's calm. For an instant, there was pure silence, then pandemonium. Screams erupted as the congregation dove for cover. Ethan staggered back from the pulpit, a crimson stain spreading across his pristine white robe. The second shot came a heartbeat later. This time, Ethan crumpled to the ground. His legs buckled and he collapsed at the base of the pulpit, the very spot where he had been preaching moments before. His Bible slipped from his hand and thudded onto the floor beside him. Gasps and cries echoed from all corners of the church, but no one rushed forward. No one knew what to do. Margaret stood over her son, the smoking gun in her hand. She did not run. She did not weep. She simply lowered the weapon and raised her eyes to the cross hanging above the altar, standing motionless amid the chaos she had unleashed. Police sirens wailed in the distance, drawing closer. Within minutes, officers swarmed into the church. They found a scene of absolute panic. People crying, others cowering under pews, the pastor lying in a pool of blood at the front. And there was Margaret Cole, standing calmly in the aisle, the gun dangling from her fingers at her side. An officer approached her cautiously, weapon drawn, but Margaret offered no resistance. She allowed him to take the gun from her hand. She turned and put her hands together, submitting as another officer fastened handcuffs around her wrists.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
As Margaret was led out of the sanctuary, past faces frozen in shock, past the very people she had once greeted every Sunday morning. She spoke softly, but her voice carried through the stunned silence. "No one disgraces the name of the Lord," she said. Margaret was taken into police custody without incident. She didn't utter another word, nor did she struggle or protest. At the station, she did not ask for a lawyer or make any statements. She simply sat in the interrogation room, hands folded in her lap, her eyes steady and far away, as detectives came and went. Back at the church, detectives began untangling the nightmare that had unfolded. Witnesses were shaken and hysterical. Many were in disbelief, trying to convince themselves that the shooting was the result of some personal dispute, a mother driven temporarily insane. But as investigators dug deeper, a far darker picture began to emerge. Daniel Cole, still groggy from the sedative, was questioned once the drugs had fully worn off. At first, he struggled to comprehend what the police were asking him. Why had Margaret done this? What had happened the night before? As the questions grew more pointed, fragments of memory surfaced. The sudden drowsiness in Ethan's office, Margaret's strange silence on the ride home, her trembling hands. Piece by piece, Daniel began to understand what he had been too dazed to grasp before. And with that understanding came devastation. Julia Cole was also brought in for questioning. Initially, she was simply the grieving widow of a beloved pastor, bewildered and heartbroken. But when detectives carefully explained what they'd learned, about Ethan's abuses, about what Margaret had witnessed, Julia's sorrow turned to horror. She admitted there had been moments in their marriage when she felt something was off, but she never could have imagined the truth. Every memory she had of her husband was now cast in a terrible new light. The real breakthrough came when one of Ethan's victims bravely stepped forward to speak with police. It was the same teenager whose father had approached Daniel weeks before. Now, with Ethan dead and the secret out in the open, the boy told investigators everything. He spoke of how Ethan had gained his trust, how the pastor's private mentorship had gradually crossed every line, and how Ethan had twisted scripture and faith to justify the abuse. It was a harrowing testimony, but it opened the floodgates. Soon, more young men came forward, some still part of the congregation, others who had drifted away over the years. Their stories were much the same. All of them had been carefully groomed and exploited by Ethan Cole under the guise of spiritual guidance. The investigators uncovered physical evidence as well. In Ethan's office, they found an empty bottle of prescription sedatives, confirming Daniel's drink had been drugged. They also found Ethan's private journal, filled with deranged entries where he rationalized his actions as special relationships or tests from God. Margaret, for her part, refused to elaborate on her statement. She never described to the police exactly what she saw in that office. She didn't need to. The evidence spoke for her. The community now understood why she had pulled the trigger in that church. The motive was clearer than ever. Margaret Cole had walked in on a monstrous secret, one that shattered her faith and her family in an instant, and she had responded in the only way she believed she could. By the time all the details became public, the congregation was in collective shock. Their cherished pastor was not the man they thought he was. Ethan Cole had not been a martyr or a hero. He had been a predator hiding behind a pulpit. Margaret Cole never once denied shooting her son. At her trial, she sat quietly as witness after witness recounted the events of that Sunday morning. Prosecutors presented their case. A cold-blooded, premeditated murder carried out in front of a church full of people. There was no insanity plea, no dramatic testimony from the defense. Margaret's lawyers simply argued that she had acted out of a mother's desperate sense of justice. When Margaret herself was asked if she had any regret, she replied with the same words she had spoken in the church. No one disgraces the name of the Lord. After a short deliberation, less than 4 hours, the jury returned with a verdict of guilty. Margaret was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the aftermath, public opinion was deeply divided. Some condemned Margaret outright, unable to see past the violence of her act. To them, she was a murderer no different from any other. But others saw her in a more complex light. When the full truth of Ethan's crimes emerged, many believed that Margaret had done what no one else had the courage to do. She had stopped a monster that had grown in their midst. Daniel Cole was never the same after losing his son and his wife in the span of one morning. He carried an unbearable burden of guilt. How could he not have seen what was happening? How could he have dismissed that boy's story so easily? In the months after the trial, Daniel's health went into steep decline. He suffered a heart attack less than a year later, passing away in his sleep. Some say he died of a broken heart and the weight of shame. Julia Cole could no longer bear to live under the shadow of what had happened. Overwhelmed by grief and betrayal, she packed up her life and her young daughter and left town. She even changed their last name, hoping to free Grace from the stigma of her father's legacy. Julia never spoke publicly about Ethan again. For her, the man she had married died long before the gunshots rang out in that church. The community itself was left in turmoil. The once thriving congregation split down the middle. A few steadfast members refused to accept the accusations against Ethan, claiming that the media had exaggerated or twisted the story. But most could not escape the truth. They felt anger, betrayal, and sorrow, knowing they had elevated a man who was living a lie. Church attendance plummeted. Within a year, the doors of the Cole family's church closed for good. Margaret's case remains one of the most shocking and disturbing acts of family violence in recent memory. But long after the headlines faded, one truth remained. This wasn't just a story of murder. It was a story of secrets, faith, and the darkness that can hide behind righteousness. Faith can be a powerful force, but what happens when it's built on lies? Margaret Cole believed she was delivering justice, but in the end, her actions left nothing but destruction in their wake. If stories like this need to be told, if these truths should never be forgotten, then like this video, share it, and subscribe to True Crimes Corner. Because the worst crimes don't just happen in the shadows. They happen where no one expects them.